What's up? Today we are looking at an absolute shocker. The young Iranian prodigy Sina Movahed has the white pieces against the final boss of chess, Magnus Carlsen. Spoiler alert, this kid doesn't just survive, he gives the former world champion a masterclass in positional squeezing and endgame technique. Let's see how he does it. Sina opens the game with e4, and Magnus goes for the Sicilian Defense, c5. White develops the knight to f3, and black responds with e6. Sina brings the other knight out to c3, while the former world champion develops his own knight to c6. Now white goes for the Rossolimo setup, bringing the bishop out to b5. Magnus immediately jumps into the center, planting the knight on d4. Sina just castles kingside, keeping his options open. Black kicks that bishop with a6. White drops it back to d3. Magnus decides to retreat the knight to c6. Sina immediately repositions his knight to d5, taking up a ton of space right in the middle of the board. Black plays d6 to clamp down on the dark squares. White reroutes the knight to e3. Magnus prepares to fianchetto with g6. Sina supports his center, pushing c3. Black develops the bishop to g7, aiming down that long diagonal. White tucks the light-squared bishop away to c2. Magnus brings the knight to e7. Sina strikes in the center with d4. Black captures with c on d4. White recaptures with c on d4. Magnus castles kingside. Sina places the rook on e1, eyeing the semi-open file. Magnus challenges the center directly, pushing e5. Sina pushes past with d5, clamping down on the position and gaining a massive space advantage. Black jumps the knight to d4. White plays b3 to solidify the queenside structure. Magnus decides to trade off the strong bishop, captures with knight on c2. Sina recovers with queen on c2, and now Magnus goes for the aggressive break, pushing f5 to rip open lines on the kingside and create some chaos. Sina calmly develops the dark-squared bishop to a3, putting long-range pressure on the d6 pawn. Magnus expands on the queenside with b5. White brings the last piece into the game, sliding the rook to c1. Black lifts the rook to a7, a classic Sicilian defensive maneuver to protect the 7th rank. Sina jumps the knight to g5, looking directly at that weak e6 square. Magnus pushes f4, gaining space but leaving permanent holes behind. White reroutes the knight to f1. Black kicks the active knight with h6, but Sina completely ignores the threat and plants the knight on e6, a beautiful, annoying outpost that just paralyzes Black's position. Magnus has to eliminate it, captures with bishop on e6. White recaptures with d on e6, creating a very dangerous passed pawn. Black slides the rook to f6 to round it up. Sina defends it indirectly by bringing the rook to d1, piling up pressure on the d-file. Magnus finally captures with rook on e6. Sina plays h3, making some loft for the king and preventing any back rank tricks. Black doubles up with the rook to d7. White improves the knight to h2. Magnus steps the king to h7. Sina brings the knight to f3, eyeing the g5 square. Black stops that with g5. White lifts the rook to d2, preparing to double on the d-file. Magnus maneuvers the knight to g6. Sina doubles the rook to d1. The pressure on d6 is absolutely immense now. Black pushes h5, trying to create counterplay on the king side. Sina invades with the queen to c6, pinning everything down. Magnus steps the king to h6 to unpin the g-pawn. And here Sina cashes in on the massive pressure. He captures with rook on d6. Magnus recaptures with rook on d6. White recaptures with rook on d6. Black recovers with rook on d6. Sina captures with bishop on d6. The smoke clears and White has a dominant position with a much better minor piece. Magnus centralizes the queen to f6. White plays queen to d7, keeping Black completely tied up. Black retreats the bishop to f8. Sina drops the bishop to c7. Magnus pushes b4. White centralizes the queen to d5. Black plays bishop to g7. Sina attacks the knight with bishop to d8. Magnus moves the knight to e7. White offers a queen trade with queen to c5, knowing the endgame is completely winning. Black retreats the bishop to f8. Sina forces the issue, captures with queen on e5. Magnus recaptures with queen on e5. White recaptures with knight on e5. We are now in a minor piece endgame, and Sina is up a clean pawn with a much better structure. Magnus plays knight to c8. Sina immediately gives check with knight to f7. Black steps the king to g6. White grabs another pawn, captures with knight on g5. Magnus centralizes the knight to d6. Sina jumps the knight to e6, hitting the bishop. Black moves the bishop to h6. White solidifies the kingside with f3. Magnus plays knight to b5. Sina attacks the a6 pawn with knight to c7. Black counterattacks with knight to c3. White simply captures with knight on a6. Sina is now up 2 full pawns. Magnus retreats the bishop to f8. White drops the bishop to c7. Black brings the king to g5. Sina steps the king to f1, bringing it into the game. Magnus grabs a pawn back, captures with knight on a2. But Sina creates a beautiful mating net. He pushes h4, check. Black has to captures with king on h4. White captures with bishop on f4, completely cutting off the king's escape route. Magnus tries to save the knight with knight to c3. Sina maneuvers the knight to c7. Black plays bishop to e7. White jumps the knight to e6. Magnus plays bishop to f6. Sina pushes e5. Black retreats the bishop to e7. And Sina plays the final crushing move, knight to d4. Magnus Carlsen resigns right here. The reason is simple. White's knight and bishop completely paralyze Black's pieces. The Black king is stuck on the edge of the board, White is up a clean pawn, and the e-pawn is ready to march down the board. A brilliant technical conversion by the young prodigy against the greatest of all time. If you enjoyed this endgame masterclass, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe.